On the evening of Wednesday, September 9th, 2009, 20-year-old Shelley Nance walked into her bedroom inside of her off-campus apartment in Dallas, Texas, and then shut the door behind her. Shelley liked the fact that once inside of her room, she would not need to speak to anybody. She preferred it that way. She settled down on her bed with her back propped against a stack of pillows, and then she took out her notebook and pencil and began to draw. Shelley spent most of her time drawing on a computer at the Art Institute of Dallas, where she was a second-year multimedia and animation student. But when she was by herself and just wanted to relax, she preferred just using pencil and paper. Tonight, Shelley began sketching a young woman who looked a lot like herself, slender with long flowing hair, and just the hint of a smile on her face. Shelley originally began drawing to escape the boredom of growing up in the tiny town of Italy, Texas, where she'd always been something of a loner. She even joked about that in her senior yearbook, choosing a biting quote to go with her picture. She wrote, "You laugh at me because I'm different. I laugh at you because you're all the same." But Shelley got so good at drawing that it actually changed her life. She eventually won an art competition that gave her a partial scholarship to this art institute, and suddenly, Shelley had a plan for life after high school, to be an artist. As soon as she got to the art school and started meeting her eccentric and creative classmates, Shelley felt like she'd finally found her place. For the first time ever, she had friends who actually understood and accepted her quirks. They would go to anime conventions together and even dress up as their favorite anime characters. It was a world that Shelley frankly never could have imagined back in her hometown, which was basically no more than a truck stop along a highway. And going to this art institute provided another big first for Shelley. She had a boyfriend, Nathan Shuck, and they often could be found playing video games together on the couch at his apartment. But as Shelley sat there sketching tiny doves into her picture, she realized that having this active social life now could actually be kind of a burden. Until recently, she had never had to consider anybody else's feelings but her own, but now having a boyfriend meant she had to plan for two people. And after dating Nathan for 2 months now, she was actually starting to have her doubts about the relationship. She thought Nathan was a good person, but deep down, she knew she didn't feel about him the way he felt about her. Now, she didn't want to hurt his feelings, but at the same time, she couldn't help but feel really strongly that she kind of just wanted to break up with him. She just had no idea how to actually tell him. Shelley put her pencil down and closed her sketch pad, hoping for a new distraction, and she found one after she hopped on her computer and went on a popular website looking at other artists' work. And Shelley's thoughts very quickly kind of drifted away from Nathan and the seemingly imminent, unpleasant conversation that she was going to have with him. After a while, Shelley looked up at the clock, and she was shocked to see that it was already 6 a.m. She'd been up all night. She really needed to get some rest before her classes that afternoon. So she left her room to make sure the front door was locked, then she went back to her bedroom, closed the door, crawled back into bed, and drifted off to sleep. A little more than 24 hours later, at 7 a.m. on Friday, September 11th, Shelley's mother, Cynthia, woke up in a motel in Colorado. She and her husband were a little over halfway through their 22-hour drive to Yellowstone National Park, which was like their dream trip. While they raised their 3 girls, they barely ever left their small town in Texas. But now that Shelley, their youngest, was settled in college, they'd finally decided to take the plunge and go do this big trip. When they'd hit the road Thursday morning, Cynthia sent a text message to all 3 of the girls, and Shelley was the only one who didn't text back. But Cynthia was not that worried about it, because Shelley was a night owl and she often slept during the day when everybody else was up and about. But Shelley would usually call at some point after she woke up for class, except this time she didn't. And so Cynthia had called one of Shelley's sisters to say she was worried, but the sister thought their mother was just overreacting. And so she told her mom, hey, remember, she's an adult. She's a 20-year-old woman who's allowed to have a social life. In fact, her sister was happy that maybe Shelley the homebody was out somewhere having fun for once. At 9 a.m. that same morning, Cynthia and her husband went for a scenic ride through the Colorado Rockies. But Cynthia barely noticed any of it, because she still hadn't heard from Shelley, and she just had this gut feeling that something was actually wrong. And so as they drove through this beautiful area, Cynthia grabbed her phone and called Shelley's school. A school administrator answered the call, but she sounded annoyed at Cynthia's request. She said they just didn't have the resources to send somebody out to check on every student who didn't call their parents right on time. Cynthia knew she was coming off like an overprotective mother, but she also knew it was completely unlike Shelley to ignore her messages for this long. So Cynthia practically begged the administrator to please check later that day and just see if her daughter made it to class. The administrator sighed and said she'd wait for a break between classes and see if someone could track Shelley down. Around noon that day, Shelley's roommate, Ashley Alvera, grumpily made her way up the stairs towards their apartment. Someone from the school administration had stopped Ashley when she was leaving class and asked her to just stop what she was doing and go back to her apartment and check on her roommate, Shelley, make sure she's okay. Apparently, Shelley's parents were looking for her, and she wasn't returning any calls or texts. But Ashley thought this request was totally ridiculous. Shelley's parents did not need to know where Shelley was 24/7. She was an adult. And so now Ashley felt like her time was being wasted. But nonetheless, she made it upstairs to the apartment, she unlocked the door, and walked inside. And once she was inside the apartment, she noticed the door to Shelley's bedroom was closed, as usual, and so she walked over and knocked, and she didn't get an answer. Then she called out Shelley's name, but she was met with more silence, so Ashley opened the door. And there in bed was Shelley, lying face down under the blanket. And so Ashley quickly went from feeling annoyed at this to now just feeling angry. She'd come all the way back to the apartment to check on her roommate just to find out Shelley had been sleeping all day. So Ashley walked over and kind of gruffly told Shelley, "Hey, wake up, your parents are looking for you." But Shelley didn't move. Ashley sighed and walked back over to the door and flipped on the light in the room, but when the lights were now on, Shelley didn't react. And so now, feeling sort of on edge, Ashley walked back over to the bed and gently shook Shelley, but Shelley didn't move. And also, Shelley's arm felt cold to the touch. And that's when Ashley just grabbed the blanket and pulled it back, and she saw Shelley's sheets were soaked in blood. Absolutely horrified, Ashley screamed Shelley's name over and over again, but Shelley wasn't moving or making any sound, and so Ashley turned and ran out of the room to call 911. Not long after that 911 call, the school called Cynthia back and began to tell her what was going on. They told her her daughter had been found in her room, she was covered in blood, and then before the caller from the school could explain further, Cynthia's cell phone just went dead. The reception in the Colorado mountains where they were was terrible, and so she had just dropped service. And so Cynthia, who's heard this terrible thing about her daughter, began frantically trying to call back, but she just couldn't get any service. And so Cynthia shouted at her husband to turn the car around and keep driving until she got better phone reception. Her husband immediately did a U-turn and hit the gas, making the tires squeal, and then just as suddenly as Cynthia had lost service, she suddenly had service again. And so she screamed at her husband to stop the car so she could call them back. And so Cynthia, whose hand was now shaking, finally got through to the Art Institute and breathlessly asked them if her daughter was okay. And the woman on the other end said she was so sorry, but Shelley was dead. Police were investigating right now, but it appeared her daughter had been murdered. Cynthia and her husband just sat there in silence in the middle of nowhere, absorbing the worst news a parent can possibly receive. Cynthia felt this desperate urge to do something, visit Shelley's apartment, talk to detectives, or just be there to comfort their other daughters. But they had no choice but to just start driving again because it was going to take them nearly a day to drive all the way back to Texas. At about the same time that Cynthia and her husband got this terrible news, Detective Paul Elzy placed a fan belt and motor oil on the checkout counter at a Dallas auto shop. He was heading out to his farm in East Texas that weekend and was looking forward to doing some maintenance on his tractor. And just as he finished paying, his phone rang. It was his partner. His partner said they had a murder to solve, and it was a tough one. A young art student had been stabbed to death in her bed with no witnesses, and so far, no evidence. Suddenly, Elzy knew he was not going to be spending time at his farm. So he left the auto shop, got into his car, and drove across town to Shelley's apartment complex. Elzy walked up the stairs to Shelley's apartment and stepped inside. And already it was flooded with evidence technicians who were dusting for fingerprints and snapping photos. Elzy's partner greeted him and quickly got him up to speed. The victim's roommate discovered the body around noon, but she said she didn't know anything else because she'd been away at class all morning. Unfortunately, the technicians had not found anything useful so far. No fingerprints, shoe prints, or hairs near the body that could give police some clues to who the killer was. Detective Elzy thanked his partner for the update and said he wanted to take his own look around the small apartment to see if anything stood out. Elzy was a seasoned homicide detective with 36 years on the force. He saw each case as a challenge, a puzzle he would need to solve, and sometimes the pieces did just kind of fall into place. Inside the apartment, he noticed the TV and some other fairly expensive electronic equipment were still there. Also, the windows weren't broken, and there didn't appear to be any signs of forced entry. So this didn't seem like a robbery. More likely, Elsie thought, the victim let the killer into their apartment, or the killer had a key. Elsie walked into the bathroom next to Shelley's bedroom and realized why there was so little blood tracked around the apartment. He could see a spot of blood on the edge of the sink, as well as a few spots on the edge of the tub. The killer had clearly tried to clean themselves up after committing the murder, and so whoever killed Shelley had thought this crime through and potentially had really thought through how to get away with it. Elsie then headed to the bedroom to look at the victim. Shelley was lying on her stomach on the bed in a shirt and underwear. Her back and neck were covered in wounds, and her long reddish-brown hair was now matted with dried blood. Elsie had seen countless bodies over his long career, and he usually kept a very cool professional distance from the victims' lives. But he was not prepared for what lay before him now. The murder was gruesome, but that wasn't what unsettled him. It was Shelley herself. She was the same age as one of Elsie's daughters, and he suddenly felt like he was looking at his own child lying there, covered in blood. Elsie composed himself and leaned over the bed and looked more closely at the condition of Shelley's body. He couldn't even count the number of stab wounds in her neck and back, but there didn't seem to be wounds anywhere else, including her hands and arms. The lack of defensive wounds made Elsie think that Shelley had not put up much of a fight against her attacker. Plus, all the blood seemed to be concentrated on the bed, while the rest of the bedroom looked basically undisturbed, as though Shelley never had a chance to get up. So maybe she was asleep when this happened. Shelley's clothes were still on and relatively undisturbed, making Elsie think she had not been sexually assaulted as well. But looking at her battered body, Elsie saw a killer that must have been filled with rage. And this rage-filled killer clearly had ready access to this apartment. And so the detective felt certain that Shelley must have been killed by someone she knew who must have had a very personal and serious problem with her. Later on that day, sometime in the afternoon, the medical examiner provided a more detailed picture of what actually killed Shelley. Both her carotid artery and her jugular vein, which are in her neck, were severed, and her esophagus and trachea had been punctured, as well as one of her lungs. And so Shelley had suffered multiple wounds that on their own would have killed her, but she had several of these fatal wounds. Yet beyond the savage attack on Shelley's upper body, there were basically no other injuries. Not only were there no additional stab wounds, the medical examiner also concluded that Shelley had not been sexually assaulted. And the killer left behind almost no obvious physical clues, except perhaps one. As the medical examiner was swabbing under Shelley's fingernails in hopes that maybe she might have scratched her killer, he spotted a blue speck under Shelley's left wrist. It looked like nothing more than a tiny piece of plastic, but it was the only physical evidence the killer seemed to have left behind. So he had sent it off to the lab to be tested. Detective Elsie was interviewing Shelley's roommate, Ashley, at the police station when he heard a knock at the door, and one of the officers handed him the autopsy results. Elsie stepped into the hallway outside of the interview room and quickly scanned over the report for highlights, and one finding jumped off the page at him. From the condition of Shelley's body, the medical examiner estimated that she had been dead for up to 24 hours by the time Ashley found her. Elsie was startled. He had assumed that Shelley must have been killed no more than a few hours before Ashley found her, but now the medical examiner was saying that the murder most likely happened a full day earlier, sometime on Thursday, not Friday. And this cast the murder into a whole new light. And so Elsie went back into the interview room with lots of new questions for Ashley. It dawned on Elsie that if Ashley's story was to be believed, that meant Ashley had been living with the corpse of a roommate for the better part of a full day. Ashley had said that she and Shelley were really never friends, they were just roommates, and it wasn't uncommon for them to go days without seeing each other. In fact, Ashley had already told Elsie that the last time she had seen Shelley was Wednesday morning before she'd left for class, so 48 hours before Shelley had been found. But despite that, Elsie really just wanted to know where Ashley was all day on Thursday when she apparently didn't see her roommate at all. Ashley told him she'd left for class at 9 a.m. that day and then come back to the apartment at 3 p.m. And for the rest of the day, Ashley said she stayed at the apartment, eating dinner, doing homework, and then going to bed. Elsie's eyebrows shot up, and he held up the autopsy results. And then he told Ashley that the report showed her roommate had been killed earlier than police realized initially. He told her that if what she was saying was true, she'd gone about her business in their small apartment for 18 hours with a dead body in the next room. How was that possible? But Ashley only seemed confused, like she couldn't quite process the information she had just been given. She said she really didn't know what he was talking about, but the detective thought that just wasn't good enough. Elsie pointed out that the roommates shared a single bathroom and that investigators found blood on the sink and in the bathtub. How could Ashley possibly have missed the blood? Didn't it make her worry about her roommate? At that point, Ashley began to cry. She did see the blood, but it was only a few spots, so she didn't think Shelley was hurt in any serious way. But still, Elsie was not persuaded. He thought there was more going on here than Ashley was saying. So he asked her, was there any problem between them? Ashley insisted that they'd only had minor disagreements, just girl stuff, she said. The detective wondered what that meant exactly, and so he said, were they fighting over the same love interest or something? But Ashley swore that never happened. Shelley had a boyfriend, Nathan, and Ashley was not interested in him at all. In fact, Ashley said she had very little contact with Nathan, and she kind of liked it that way. Friends of hers told her that Nathan actually had a really bad temper. He apparently loved playing video games so much that if something went bad for him in the game, he would just totally lose his cool and explode. Detective Elsie thought Ashley's answers still seemed off. In fact, they were so far off that Elsie started to see Ashley as a suspect. After all, who would have had easier access to the apartment than Shelley's own roommate? But Elsie decided to try a new tactic, and he asked Ashley, was there anybody else besides her who had a key to this apartment? And Ashley told him that besides her and Shelley, no one else did. At this point, Detective Elsie couldn't help but feel convinced that Ashley must have had something to do with Shelley's death. If Ashley had the only other key, well, then she was either directly responsible, or perhaps she was the one who let the killer into the apartment. He didn't know which it was, but based on how nervous Ashley looked at this moment, he had a pretty good idea how to find out. So he just came out and accused Ashley outright of the murder. He told her to confess, and that things would actually be much easier for her if she did. But Ashley just stared back at the detective in total disbelief and began to cry again. For the next couple of hours, Detective Elsie tried to wear Ashley down, hoping for a confession that would wrap up the case. But Ashley did not change her story, and she never confessed to anything. By Saturday, September 12th, after an excruciating, mentally torturous journey, Shelley's parents finally arrived back in Texas and went to meet with Detective Elsie. When they came into the station, Elsie thought they looked like they hadn't slept the entire drive back, and he knew they were obviously grieving. But he did need to talk to them right now regardless of their condition. Their answers could be the key to finding out who killed their daughter. And so the first question he asked them was, were there any problems between Shelley and her roommate Ashley that they were aware of? Her parents seemed surprised by the question. They said their daughter and her roommate Ashley weren't exactly good friends, but they certainly didn't have any major problems that they knew of. Elsie followed up by asking if they could think of anyone who might want to hurt Shelley. Did she have any enemies? But her parents said that Shelley had always been a bit of a homebody who kept to herself, and because she didn't really go out much, there wasn't any drama in her life and very little opportunity to make enemies. Cynthia said that of their 3 daughters, Shelley was the easiest to raise. She never drank alcohol or did drugs, stayed out late, or got into trouble. After that, Detective Elsie asked them what Shelley's boyfriend, Nathan, was like. Shelley's mom said they'd never met him since they'd only been dating for a couple of months. The only thing Shelley had said about Nathan was that her dad probably wouldn't like him, but it was just because he had a lip piercing and tattoos. However, Cynthia did tell the detective that a couple of weeks ago, Shelley had called her to ask how to break up with her boyfriend, Nathan. Cynthia had given her some advice, but after that, she had no idea if Shelley actually had broken up with him or not. Now, Elsie needed to know whether Shelley had followed through and ended that relationship with Nathan. If the guy had a hot temper, as Shelley's roommate claimed, a bad breakup, in theory, could be enough to send him into a rage. Later that day, when Elsie walked into the interrogation room to speak to Nathan for the first time, he was surprised to see Nathan's appearance. Even though he had tattoos and a piercing, he was really just kind of a skinny kid. And the way he was sitting in the chair seemed so childlike. He had pulled his feet up onto the seat and was kind of clutching his knees close to his chest the way a child would. But Elsie knew looks could be deceiving, so right away, he asked where Nathan had been on Thursday, the day of Shelley's murder. Nathan said he'd been staying at his mother's house that week, and he had slept there on Wednesday night. On Thursday morning, his mother had dropped him off at the school at around 9 a.m., but he didn't have school until 3. The detective couldn't believe what Nathan had just told him. He had just admitted that he had this big window of time on the day Shelley was murdered that was basically unaccounted for. Nathan told the detective that all he had done that day was homework in the computer lab during the 6 hours before his 3 p.m. class, but Elsie was sure that Nathan had left at some point for some amount of time, maybe to go to the bathroom or maybe to get something to eat, something. He just felt like 6 hours sitting in the same spot doing homework nonstop sounded sort of unlikely for even the most diligent of students. But Elsie kept that to himself and just asked Nathan if he had a key to Shelley's apartment. But Nathan said he didn't. Elsie asked him why not. If Nathan was her boyfriend, wouldn't Shelley give him a key? But Nathan said they'd only been dating a couple of months, and really their relationship was not that serious. They hadn't had sex, in fact they hadn't even kissed. He told the detective the only thing they'd ever done that was sort of intimate was hold hands. Elsie was convinced that Nathan had to be downplaying his relationship with Shelley to kind of make himself seem less culpable. I mean, after all, what college couple didn't do anything more than hold hands if they've been dating for a couple of months? I mean, it just seemed kind of unrealistic. But Nathan swore that really was the truth, and he insisted that holding hands was actually a really big deal for both of them. At this point, the detective realized he was likely dealing with a very sheltered and somewhat awkward kid. But he also knew about Nathan's reputation for having a really bad temper, and so maybe he could get Nathan to show it by catching him off guard. So the detective directly confronted him. He asked Nathan how he felt when Shelley broke up with him. Was he angry? Did he lose control? Is that what happened? But Nathan didn't seem angry at all. He seemed confused. He said he didn't know what the detective was talking about because Shelley had not broken up with him. Elsie told Nathan he was lying. He knew from Shelley's mother that Shelley definitely wanted to break up with him, and he told Nathan his new theory. Shelley must have ended their relationship, and Nathan had been so upset he had flown into a rage and killed Shelley. But to Elsie's surprise, instead of protesting his innocence, Nathan barely reacted. He just sat there staring. Elsie asked him, "What are you thinking about?" And Nathan just said he felt sort of numb, that he didn't know how to react, that this felt like a bad dream he was just hoping to wake up from. Following a hunch, Elsie then asked Nathan to lift up his shirt. Nathan did what he was told and stood and lifted it up, and the detective could see visible scratches on his chest. Elsie immediately wondered if maybe he got those scratches from Shelley as she tried to fight off her attacker, maybe at first, because he knew she didn't put up much of a fight, but maybe she put up a little bit of a fight and that was it. But Nathan said no, he got those scratches actually from scratching himself. He said he didn't kill his girlfriend and he really had nothing to hide. At this point, Elsie saw an opening. If that was true, that Nathan had nothing to hide, would he let detectives search his apartment right now? Nathan said, yeah, go ahead, they wouldn't find anything. And so, a little while later that day, Elsie and some other investigators followed Nathan up the steps to his off-campus apartment. When they got to the door, Nathan unlocked it and let them inside. Elsie told Nathan to wait by the front door, and he had a detective stay with him. Elsie didn't want Nathan to interfere. When Elsie got inside the apartment, the first thing he noticed was the apartment was incredibly clean. He'd been inside a fair number of college apartments, and typically, they were a mess. He turned to Nathan and asked him, why is this place so immaculate? Had he cleaned it up recently, hoping to hide evidence? But Nathan said that he had nothing to do with how the apartment looked. His roommate was a total neat freak who couldn't bear the sight of dirty dishes or things lying around the house. Nathan said his roommate even cleaned up after him. Elsie nodded and then asked which room was Nathan's, and Nathan raised a hand and pointed him in the right direction. The detective went inside the bedroom, and within minutes, he made a troubling discovery. Nathan stored weapons underneath his bed. The detective found throwing stars and swords, but most disturbingly were all the knives. Boxes and boxes of knives. Elsie felt sure he would find the murder weapon among all these blades, so he bagged up each knife individually to be tested for blood. After that, Elsie left the bedroom and confronted Nathan again. He asked if Nathan had a fascination with violence, but Nathan said it really wasn't like that. He just liked to collect weapons that he thought were cool. Elsie didn't know what to make of that, but he was not convinced. Next, Elsie went to Nathan's bathroom, which, unlike the rest of the apartment, was a total mess. The counter was covered with containers of deodorant, hair gel, and shaving cream. There was stuff everywhere. But tucked in amongst the chaos was something very odd, even chilling. It was a clear sandwich bag with what appeared to be long reddish-brown hair inside, hair that was the same color as Shelley's. But that wasn't all. There was also what appeared to be drops of blood inside the bag as well. Carefully, with a gloved hand, Elsie lifted the bag up and then went to Nathan and held the bag out in front of him, demanding to know what he was doing with it. But Nathan, whose face now went white, swore he'd never seen it before in his life. He didn't even know what it was, and after all, who would collect a random sandwich bag of hair and blood? It made no sense. And then something shifted in Nathan's mind, and he said he wanted a lawyer before he answered any more questions, and he asked the investigators to please get out of his apartment. Since the detectives didn't have a search warrant, and they were there only as Nathan's guest, legally they had no choice but to leave. But they could keep everything they'd already found, and Elsie was very confident that one of the knives, and also that baggie, would come back positive for Shelley's blood. On Friday, September 18th, so a week after Shelley's body had been discovered, the school held a memorial service for her. When Shelley's parents got there, they were touched to see that Shelley's beautiful art was on display. Shelley's mother, Cynthia, was also moved by just how many people had come out to celebrate Shelley. She never thought her quiet, introverted daughter would have such a large group of friends. It was a small comfort, but a comfort nonetheless, that Shelley had meant something to so many people. Then a young man with a lip piercing and tattoos approached Cynthia. He introduced himself as Nathan, Shelley's boyfriend. He told her he wasn't sure if he should be speaking to her, but he just wanted her to know how sorry he was that Shelley had died, and then he held out his hand for her to shake it. But Shelley's mother couldn't do it. She had seen the look on Detective Elsie's face after she had mentioned the breakup, and she knew exactly what the detective was thinking, that Shelley's boyfriend, Nathan, had murdered Shelley. And now, with Nathan standing right in front of her, Cynthia couldn't help but feel repulsed, and so she did not shake his hand, and so Nathan just stood there awkwardly for a second, and then Nathan got the hint, lowered his hand, and walked away. By the end of September, the analysis of the knives and the baggie that were taken from Nathan's apartment came back from the lab. The first result shocked Elsie. None of the knives in Nathan's apartment had any traces of blood, Shelley's or anybody else's. However, that little baggie containing the hair inside of Nathan's bathroom did have blood in it, and it belonged to Shelley. And so Elsie assumed, after Nathan killed his girlfriend, he must have taken that as sort of like a trophy from the murder scene to add to his bizarre collection. So, on October 8th, 2009, almost a month after Shelley was murdered, Detective Elsie called Nathan to the police station for a second interview. But this time, Nathan showed up with his lawyer. And the lawyer, who spoke on behalf of Nathan, said that Nathan was happy to answer the officer's questions and wanted to do whatever he could to help catch Shelley's killer. But the lawyer hoped that this conversation would be civil. Elsie knew what that meant. He would have to keep a lid on how aggressively he questioned Nathan, or potentially they would just leave. And so Elsie nodded and then told Nathan that the bag they'd found in his bathroom contained his girlfriend's hair and blood. And so he asked Nathan to please explain how it got there. Nathan's lawyer looked down at Nathan and nodded, letting him know it was okay to answer this question. Nathan took a deep breath and then looked at Elsie and told him he had never seen that baggie before. He swore it. But he argued that that really shouldn't be that surprising. After all, he was not the only person who lived in that apartment. And his roommate, whose name was Daniel Willem, did have easy access to the bathroom. And Nathan didn't stop there. He claimed that his roommate, Daniel, was jealous of his relationship with Shelley because Daniel actually had a crush on Nathan. In fact, Nathan said Daniel had gotten really possessive of him and wanted to control him. Elsie asked Nathan if his roommate, Daniel, had ever made a legitimate pass at Nathan, like really tried to be romantically involved with him, and Nathan said no, he had not. And so even though Elsie didn't know what to make of this, he suspected that maybe this crush that he was talking about was not real, and perhaps Nathan was just throwing his roommate under the bus to protect himself. Elsie turned to the lawyer and said that things didn't look good for his client. The investigators had found Shelley's blood in his bathroom, and he said that Nathan had a motive to hurt Shelley because he knew that she planned to break up with him. Plus, Nathan had a reputation for having an explosive temper. And so, if Nathan confessed right now to what he did, maybe the prosecutor would be lenient with him. At this point, the lawyer stood up and said the interview was over, and then he led Nathan out of the room. At this point, Elsie felt sure that Nathan really was just raising suspicions about his roommate simply to protect himself. But the detective had been around long enough to know that he would need to speak with Daniel as well, because it was true he did have access to that bathroom where that baggie was found. So, a couple of days later, Elsie got in touch with Daniel and asked him to come to the police station to answer a few questions. And once Daniel was there, Elsie decided not to ask him about his supposed crush on Nathan right away. Instead, Elsie asked Daniel where he was the morning of Shelley's murder, and Daniel described his busy day. Daniel said he went to Starbucks to grab a coffee, and then after that, he drove to the lake to take some photographs for school, and then he went to Walmart to pick up some soap and hair dye, and then after that, he'd gone to a friend's apartment to work on an assignment. However, that friend wasn't home. Elsie's ears perked up. Daniel's alibi was not any better than Nathan's. Daniel had said when he took photos at the lake, he was alone, and since the friend that he had gone to study with wasn't home, there was no one to corroborate that part of his story either. So then at this point, Elsie asked Daniel if he had romantic feelings for Nathan, and Daniel said absolutely not. Then Elsie told him that Nathan had said that Daniel was very controlling about their relationship, and he asked Daniel if that was true. And Daniel said something surprising. He said that yes, he actually was pretty controlling, but he was only doing it because he was concerned for Nathan. Daniel said that Nathan was stalking Shelley. He was following her around all the time to the point where he was ignoring his own classes and his grades were dropping. Daniel said he was actually trying to get Nathan away from Shelley. This surprised Elsie. Now, both roommates were basically suggesting that the other could have killed Shelley. And if it was true that Nathan really was stalking Shelley, well, Elsie already felt like he was the most likely suspect, and that sort of fit. At this point, Elsie asked Daniel about that little bag that contained the hair and blood inside of Nathan's bathroom. And Daniel told him he had no idea how that got there. Now, of course, if Daniel did do it, obviously he would say he didn't know where it came from. This is what Elsie was thinking. The bag with Shelley's blood and hair was easily the most damning piece of evidence they had, and both roommates claimed they knew nothing about it. So Elsie used the same tactic he had tried with Ashley and with Nathan. He flat out accused Daniel of the murder, hoping his tough cop routine would intimidate him and get him to come out and confess. But when he accused Daniel of the murder, just like Ashley and Nathan before him, Daniel swore up and down it really was not him. Elsie tried pressing him again and again, but just like Ashley and Nathan, Daniel said, "Really, I had nothing to do with this." After Daniel left the station, Detective Elsie stayed in the interview room for a few minutes, thinking about everything he had just learned. He had 3 likely suspects. There was Ashley, who apparently was just in the apartment going about her business with her roommate's dead body for 18 hours. There was Nathan, who Shelley wanted to break up with and apparently who had a very bad temper. And finally, there was Daniel, who may have seen Shelley as a romantic rival if Daniel really did have a crush on Nathan. But all 3 of these suspects totally insisted they had nothing to do with the crime. And so Elsie felt like one of them had to be lying. He just needed to figure out who. So Elsie and his team started digging deeper into each of their suspects' alibis. Elsie found himself staring at computer screens, surveillance tapes, and phone messages for days on end. But after so many hours, when he felt like he could barely keep his eyes open anymore, something on one of those screens finally jumped out at him. Elsie was staring at a brand new piece of evidence, and it pointed directly to Shelley's killer. On November 4th, almost 2 months after the murder, police moved in to make an arrest, and Elsie had a very clear idea of what had happened to Shelley. Back on Thursday, September 10th, just after 10:30 a.m., the killer drove to Shelley's apartment complex and put on a pair of latex gloves. They climbed the stairs to the apartment and used a key to unlock the door. They quietly walked in, closing the door behind them. Once inside, they went straight to Shelley's closed bedroom. Slowly, so as not to make any noise, they turned the handle and opened the door. Shelley was fast asleep. The killer slowly walked to the bed, pulled out a knife, raised it up, and then brought it down into Shelley's neck. And then before she could scream, the killer stabbed her again and again and again. The killer stabbed Shelley 42 times in the neck and back before they finally stopped and stepped away from the bed. Shelley would die without ever waking up. After the attack, the killer went into the bathroom. There, they climbed into the bathtub, took off their bloody clothes, and put them into a bag, but in the process, they got spots of blood on the edges of the tub. Then the killer went to the sink and rinsed the last of the blood off their hands, never taking their gloves off. The killer then got dressed in the fresh clothes they brought along. Then they left the apartment, closing and locking the door behind them. When Detective Elsie looked into the 3 alibis of the 3 suspects, initially it seemed like they all checked out. Ashley had been in class, Daniel really had gone to Walmart, and Nathan was in the computer lab for 6 long hours. But while Ashley was in class, something strange was happening. She was getting a near constant stream of text messages asking where she was and if she was home. Elsie believed these text messages were the murderer trying to make sure the house was empty except for Shelley. And the person who sent all those text messages to Ashley was Nathan's roommate, Daniel. Then, when investigators studied surveillance footage from Daniel's trip to Walmart on the morning of the murder, Detective Elsie caught something crucial. Daniel had purchased hair dye, just like he said, but he also purchased blue latex gloves. And the crime lab determined that the material from the brand of gloves matched that little blue piece of latex that had been found on Shelley's wrist. From there, Daniel's alibi fell apart. Surveillance showed he left Walmart at 10:12 a.m., but police could find no evidence that he went by a friend's apartment like he claimed he had. Police then began to look into whether Daniel's story about his roommate Nathan stalking Shelley was actually true, but it turned out if anybody was stalking and obsessed with Shelley, it was actually Daniel. Lots of his own friends said he disliked Shelley because she was dating Nathan, and Daniel was really interested in Nathan to the point where it seemed like he was romantically interested, despite the fact that Daniel denied that. And then also, Daniel would apparently send these aggressive text messages directly to Shelley sometimes, openly disapproving of her and Nathan's relationship, further making it seem like his motive for harming Shelley was because he wanted Nathan for himself. The last piece of the puzzle for Detective Elsie was figuring out how Daniel got into Shelley's apartment. Elsie discovered that Daniel had once borrowed Ashley's car keys, and that gave him the opportunity to make a duplicate of her and Shelley's apartment key, which he then used on the day of the murder. On November 4th, 2011, Daniel was convicted of Shelley's murder and sentenced to life in prison. After the conviction, Shelley's mother found Nathan and gave him a big hug and told him she was sorry for suspecting him and not shaking his hand at the memorial. He accepted her apology. Shelley's family created a scholarship in her honor. Every year since 2011, they've given it out to a student who was pursuing a degree in the arts. On a beautiful summer day in mid-June 2009, 37-year-old Caleb Harrison walked out the door of Maplehurst Prison in Ontario, Canada. He was a free man once again. Behind him, the correctional facility where he had just spent the last 3 months stretched out over a total of 106 acres, one of the first so-called super jails in Canada's most heavily populated province. Still feeling like a prison guard might stop him at any moment, Caleb forced himself not to hurry as he walked towards the visitors' parking lot. Just a few more minutes, he thought, as he looked down at his watch, and his mother would be pulling into the parking area right in front of him. And when she did, Caleb would climb into the comfortable passenger seat of the family car, and in 20 minutes, the two of them, mother and son, would be turning onto Pitch Pine Crescent, a leafy and quiet street in an affluent neighborhood of Ontario's third largest city, Mississauga. They would pull into the driveway of the airy and modern 6-bedroom house where Caleb's parents, Bridget and Bill, had lived for 40 years, and where Caleb, adopted at the age of 6 months, had grown up. Coming to a stop now, a few feet away from the curb, and willing his body to finally relax, Caleb tried to remind himself of how lucky he was. Not many of the inmates he'd met had a family that was as supportive and financially secure as his was. Not all of them would ever stand outside like he was, knowing that they had a ride and a place to go. But despite knowing all of that, Caleb did not feel like a lucky person. He had only been an inmate at Maplehurst for 12 weeks, but during that time, his old life had taken so many twists and turns that it seemed like it had become a total thing of the past. Something that felt as unfamiliar to him now as the cheap prison-issue clothes he was wearing and the sight of the open sky overhead when it wasn't circled by barbed wire and prison guards. And as Caleb stood there, holding on to his small bag of personal belongings and scanning the cars coming down the drive into the parking lot, he thought about that decision he'd made 4 years ago that had landed him in Maplehurst in the first place and caused tragedy for so many people. At the time, of course, Caleb had had no way of knowing he was making the worst decision of his life. The year had been 2005, and Caleb had been 33 years old. It had been a cool and clear Friday night, the first day of July, and 3 of Caleb's friends in Mississauga were going to a party. Caleb had offered to go as their designated driver, the one person in the group who would not drink and who would make sure he got the rest of them home safely. Thinking back now to that night, Caleb remembered how completely sure he had been that he wouldn't even be tempted by the alcohol, because just a few weeks before that party, he'd been shocked to find himself locked up in jail for a few days after his wife had accused him of hitting her. Caleb, who had been drinking at the time, had told police that he acted in self-defense after his wife had come after him. He'd been released from jail, but one of the conditions of his parole was that he would not touch alcohol. After that accusation of domestic violence, both Caleb and his wife Melissa had known that their 5-year-long relationship was basically over. And when the end came, it wasn't exactly a surprise. Ever since getting married in 2002, their life together had been rocky. Caleb drank too much, neither one of them was good at managing money, and Melissa had a habit of exaggerating any drama in her life, like the time she was diagnosed with an ovarian cyst, but told Caleb she'd been diagnosed with cancer. But the one really good thing to come out of their marriage had been their 2 children, and Caleb had been terrified that if he violated the conditions of his parole, Melissa might not let him see their 3-year-old son and 2-year-old daughter. But it was just the thought of all those problems and failures that had put Caleb in such a bad mood that night all those years ago that he decided to have just one drink at that party, just to make himself feel a little bit better. And since it was only going to be one drink, he'd passed on a beer and went straight for the hard liquor. By the time the party had been over, Caleb had had nearly 3 times the legal limit of alcohol in his bloodstream, and he was totally deaf to his friends telling him he had no business getting behind the wheel of his mother's Mercedes car, and that there was no way they'd get in the car with him. Leaving his friends to walk home, Caleb had stumbled into the driver's seat of the powerful vehicle, turned on the engine, and made his way out onto the main road that led back to his parents' house on Pitch Pine Crescent. Thinking back now on what happened next, Caleb gave an involuntary shiver, and despite the sun on his back, he suddenly felt ice cold. All he remembered was the dark, empty road in front of him suddenly filling with the headlights of the oncoming taxi that was carrying a driver and 4 passengers. Traveling at 60 miles an hour, Caleb had drifted into the oncoming lane, and in a shriek of tearing metal, he had hit the other car head-on. The collision had killed the 44-year-old taxi driver. 2 of his passengers made it out of the wreck with minor injuries, but the 3rd man in the taxi had had his scalp sheared completely off of his skull, while the 4th man suffered a broken arm and a broken back. Caleb had been lucky. A passerby had dragged him out of his car just before it burst into flames, and the worst injury Caleb suffered was a broken leg. Caleb also knew he'd gotten a sweet deal from the Canadian legal system, which was known for moving very slowly. After the drunk driving accident, Caleb had been charged with manslaughter, which is unintentional murder, but it had taken the court a solid 3 years to try his case, and during that time, he'd been allowed to live with his parents at 3635 Pitch Pine Crescent, and despite Melissa's objections, Caleb had also been allowed to share custody of their children, Mason and Michaela. And even though Caleb was ultimately found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, the judge sentenced him to only 18 months in prison instead of the 2 years that the prosecution had asked for, or the 5 years demanded in an online petition that was circulated on Facebook in the years before Caleb's trial actually took place. But the shorter sentence had come with a price tag. There had been an opinion piece that ran in the local newspaper, read by nearly 500,000 Mississauga residents, that called the 18 months nothing more than a, quote, slap on the wrist. And those same concerned citizens, along with the families of the deceased taxi driver and the passengers who had been injured in the drunk driving accident, were outraged all over again when Caleb had only served 3 months before being released because of good behavior while behind bars. And no one had been more upset than Melissa. Caleb's decision to drink and drive proved to her that he was an unfit father. And once Caleb had been sentenced to 18 months in prison, the courts transferred his custodial rights over to his parents. By then, his parents, Bridget and Bill, were so involved in the lives of their grandchildren that Melissa felt like she was sharing custody and organizing her kids' lives around the schedules of 3 people, and not just her ex-husband. So it was no wonder that by the time Caleb actually walked into his concrete prison cell at Maplehurst on March 9th, 2009, there was no sign left of the young couple who had fallen in love 9 years earlier. That was when Caleb and Melissa had first met while working in a store in Mississauga called My Favorite Doll. 19-year-old Melissa worked at the front counter, and Caleb, 8 years older than Melissa, had worked in the huge shipping and receiving department out back. Their romance had unfolded under the smiles of hundreds of tall, slender Barbie dolls in every style and color, stacked floor to ceiling, all standing on long legs inside their clear plastic capsules. And Melissa, with her girl-next-door good looks and her longing to get married and start a family, had seemed as perfect to Caleb as one of those dolls. Except that once they had exchanged their wedding vows, moved out of their parents' homes and into their own place 30 minutes away, and almost immediately had their first baby, the reality that had set in for Caleb and Melissa was anything but perfect. Probably the best thing that had happened for either of them since they broke up was that Caleb had met a wonderful new woman online and they had begun a serious relationship, and Melissa had also met someone new. Caleb's girlfriend, Corinda McEwen, had 2 children from an earlier relationship who got along great with Caleb. Melissa and her new boyfriend, Christopher Fattore, who went by the nickname Chris, had quickly become engaged and started a family of their own. But aside from meeting those other romantic partners, it seemed to Caleb that his life was cursed, because exactly 5 weeks after he had started serving his prison sentence, he had gotten absolutely devastating news. On the cold, clear evening of Thursday, April 16, 2009, Caleb's mother had returned home from work to find her husband Bill, Caleb's father, slumped against the wall of the downstairs bathroom, dead. According to the Peel County Medical Examiner, the cause of death was acute cardiac arrhythmia, a rare interruption in the heart's natural rhythm that can cause sudden and unexpected death even in a person as active and healthy as 64-year-old Bill Harrison had been. Meanwhile, Caleb's ex-wife, Melissa, seeing her children's lives unraveling in tragedy, their father in prison, their grandfather now dead, had abruptly decided to take the issue of custody into her own hands. Packing up her and Chris's belongings, along with Caleb and Melissa's 2 children, Mason and Michaela, and the new baby that Melissa and Chris had had together, they had all simply left Mississauga behind, disappearing without a trace and telling no one where they were going. Still reeling from the recent death of her husband, when Bridget realized her grandchildren and their mother were now just gone and she couldn't get in touch with them, she immediately filed an abduction report with Peel Regional Police. At the same time that she filed the report, she also petitioned the court for full custody of Mason and Michaela once the children were located. And then Bridget had to tell her son that not only was his father dead, but also that his children had been abducted by his ex-wife and nobody knew where they went. Still looking out over the visitors' parking area, Caleb had not even realized he was holding his breath until he saw his mother's car drive through the open security gates leading into the parking lot. Stiffening involuntarily, Caleb made another conscious effort to relax, forcing himself to take a few deep breaths. Then he stepped off the curb and started walking towards the space where his mother had just angled the car and come to a stop. As 62-year-old Bridget Harrison turned off the car engine, opened the driver's side door, and stepped out onto the pavement to give her only child a long, tight hug, her green eyes filled with tears. She'd still had no word from police about where her grandchildren were, and like Caleb, she was wondering just how much worse her life could get. 2 months had gone by since Bill's death, but instead of time making her feel any better, each day seemed to bring a new wave of grief. Even now, holding the son she loved, Bridget doubted that she'd ever recover from Bill's death. And it wasn't just because they had been married for more than 40 years. It was the fact that from the first time Bridget and Bill had met, working together at the theater festival in Stratford, Ontario back in the early 1960s, they had formed a deep bond of both love and friendship. Bridget had been an accomplished young actress who went on to have a high-profile career in the field of education. Bill had worked backstage and had gone on to have a successful career in management, eventually becoming a top executive of Sobeys, a large Mississauga-based company that owned a chain of grocery stores. Looking down into his mother's sad and tired face, Caleb also felt the terrible absence of his father. He and his mother loved one another, but it was his dad who had been the steadying presence in both of their lives, smoothing over arguments and bringing out the best in all 3 of them. As Caleb settled himself into the front passenger seat of his mother's car, he took one last look at Maplehurst Prison. Just a minute earlier, when he had helped his mom back into the car and closed the door once she was in the driver's seat, he had tried to imagine what it was going to be like to walk into the house at Pitchpine Crescent and pass that downstairs room just inside the entrance where his father had died. Caleb would not miss prison, that was for sure. But as his mom backed the car up, turned, and drove out of the parking lot, it occurred to Caleb that at least here, at Maplehurst, when he woke up every morning, he knew exactly what to expect out of each and every day. And in a weird way, that was very comforting. 5 months later, on November 27, 2009, Caleb and Bridget got the good news they had been praying for. The Peel Regional Police had located and then arrested Caleb's ex-wife, Melissa, on charges of parental abduction of their 2 children. For 7 months, Melissa and her new partner, Chris, and the children had been living under false identities in the tiny township of Londonderry, located in Nova Scotia, the easternmost province of Canada, more than 1,000 miles away from Mississauga. During that time, Melissa had given birth to her and Chris's second child. It wasn't until Chris accidentally signed a rent check using his real name that local police contacted Peel Regional Police in Mississauga to say that they might have located Caleb's missing children. For Caleb and his mother Bridget, having Mason and Michaela safely back home at 3635 Pitchpine Crescent felt like the start of a new life for all 4 of them. Melissa would have to stand trial on parental abduction charges, and eventually she and Caleb would work out a shared custody arrangement again, but for now, at least while she was out of jail on parole awaiting that trial, Melissa had to stay away from Caleb and their 2 kids, giving Caleb the time and space he had dreamed of having so he could once again bond with his kids. But if Caleb and Bridget thought that just by having Mason and Michaela back home, that the hole in their lives caused by Bill's death nearly 8 months earlier would disappear, they were both wrong. Instead, without Bill's calming presence and laid-back attitude towards life, the relationship between Caleb and Bridget grew very tense under the stress of working and also now caring for 9-year-old Mason and his 7-year-old sister, Michaela. Still, despite the friction, by early spring of 2010, Caleb, Bridget, and the kids had all settled into their routines of work and school, and mother and son both hoped that once they passed the anniversary of Bill's death, they would be able to put at least some of their grief and pain behind them. On Wednesday, April 21st, 1 year and 5 days after Bill Harrison had died, 9-year-old Mason Harrison left school at about 3 p.m. and walked home to Pitchpine Crescent. This was unusual for Mason. Since leaving Nova Scotia and living with his grandmother and father, Mason really couldn't remember a time like today when neither of them had been there after school to get him and Michaela. But since Mason was now old enough to go home on his own, he figured he'd find his grandmother at the house and just remind her that she needed to go out and get his younger sister. And Mason didn't mind. It was a cloudy but mild afternoon, and having this responsibility to walk home made him feel grown up. It was about 3:30 p.m. when Mason finally arrived home. As he walked up the driveway to the front door, he saw his grandmother's car in its usual spot, so he wasn't surprised when he didn't need to use his own key to open the door. Instead, he just walked inside, already slipping the straps of his backpack off his shoulders. But before he could even call out his grandmother's name, Mason suddenly stopped, like he was frozen in place. Because there, at the bottom of the carpeted stairs right in front of him, was his grandmother. She was sprawled out on the ground, not moving. Fully dressed, Bridget was lying on her back with her head and shoulders on the first and second step and her feet and legs on the floor. On her feet were the lightweight slip-on shoes called Crocs that she liked to wear, and scattered around her were her purse and glasses. Her arms lay out to her sides, and her green eyes were wide open. It was the sight of his grandmother's open eyes staring up without blinking that broke through Mason's sense of total shock. Dropping his backpack, he raced out the door to their neighbor's house across the street, calling out desperately for help. Within 30 minutes, Pitchpine Crescent was lined with the emergency and police vehicles that had responded to the neighbor's 911 call. And as bright yellow crime scene tape went up around the Harrisons' property and word got around that something had happened to Bridget, it wasn't long before Caleb had called a ride and then rushed to the house from work. And once Caleb was there, it wasn't long before he was joined by the same family members who had rushed to this same house just over a year ago when it was Bill who had been found dead just a few feet from where his wife now lay. It also didn't take police long to arrive at some preliminary conclusions about Bridget's death that would ultimately echo the conclusions they'd reached when they'd investigated Bill's death. The coroner, who arrived at the scene to examine Bridget's body, noticed enough injuries, like some bruising on Bridget's neck and chin, that he did not immediately rule out the possibility of foul play. Instead, he described it as a suspicious death and sent Bridget's body downtown for a full forensic autopsy. But there wasn't much else about the scene that pointed to anything other than a tragic and deadly fall down the stairs. There was no forced entry, no sign of a struggle, and when the autopsy report came back 2 days later on Friday, April 23rd, it said that Bridget's broken neck and all her other injuries were consistent with just such a fall. But even though the Peel County Homicide Bureau was not called in to investigate, the fact that 2 family members had died in the same house within a 13-month period of time raised a lot of red flags for the public, members of the Harrison family, and law enforcement. So, over the next several weeks, local investigators did some digging around on their own. And the first name at the very top of their list of people of interest was Bridget's son, Caleb. Investigators had already learned from interviews with neighbors and family and Bridget's work associates that the relationship between Caleb and his mother had been difficult, especially since Bill's death the year before. And even though Melissa was already in the process of being granted supervised access to Mason and Michaela, the custody battle that had started nearly 5 years ago had taken its toll on Bridget as well as Caleb. Not only did Bridget have to drive the children to and from school and to after-school and social activities, she also had to drive around her adult son, Caleb, because his license had been suspended following his conviction for drunk and reckless driving. But investigators quickly hit a series of dead ends. Caleb had a rock-solid alibi for the time of his mother's death. He had been at work that entire day. And when police then turned their attention to Melissa, it didn't take long for her and her husband Chris to also produce alibis for the day of Bridget's murder. By September 2nd, 2010, 5 months and 11 days after Bridget's death, police concluded that there was no evidence of any criminal action, and the investigation was closed. But for Caleb, there was no escaping the aftershocks of his mother's death. Although Melissa had the children for supervised visits, Caleb was still the sole custodial parent, and even without his mother's help, he had full responsibility for Mason and Michaela. And now the 3 of them lived inside a house where both Caleb's parents had died, and where Mason had been the one to discover Bridget's body. And while police might have cleared Caleb as a possible suspect in the death of his mother, he could still feel the cloud of suspicion that seemed to float over his head. And he also knew people were talking. Could it really be a coincidence that both of Caleb's parents had died in accidental but unusual circumstances? And given the public outrage over Caleb's driving drunk that caused the death of one person and the brutal injuries of 2 others, could it be that someone was out to punish Caleb and the whole Harrison family? As Caleb sank into a depression, he started to drink again, and it wasn't long before his girlfriend, Corinda, broke off their relationship. Melissa, meanwhile, had left Mississauga altogether. She and Chris had taken their growing family and moved to a farm in Perth County, almost 2 hours to the west. Even though Caleb had sole custody of his children, which was very contentious, the 50-mile distance between him and Melissa had eased a lot of tension between the parents, and Caleb was allowing Melissa more unsupervised time with their 2 kids. But all that changed on March 1st, 2013, when a freak fire destroyed Melissa and Chris's small brick bungalow out in Perth. Melissa and Chris were able to save themselves and the children, but the fire killed the family's pets. Heartbroken and unable to come up with the money to rebuild their little dream home, Melissa and Chris packed up and came back to Mississauga. But for Caleb, the sudden proximity to Melissa, which should have made sharing custody even easier, resulted in friction, not harmony. During the 2 years that Melissa had lived in Perth, Caleb had worked hard to get his act together and be a good father. He and Corinda were back together again, and he had a steady job at CMC Electronics. He still couldn't drive himself, but he'd arranged for a neighbor to take the children to and from school. Caleb still had periods of depression, but he no longer thought about killing himself the way he had after his mother had died. The children were 12 and 10 years old now, and most days Caleb just took them to the park.
He'd even started following his own father's footsteps by volunteering as the kids' baseball coach. With Melissa now living practically right around the corner and always looking to find fault in Caleb's parenting, Caleb had decided that when this summer was over, he'd go back to allowing Melissa only supervised access to their kids. He knew Melissa would go to court and ask for shared custody, but for Caleb, these supervised visits gave him the control he needed over his life and schedule with the kids. But even though Caleb's life was improving, it didn't take much to throw him off his stride. And that's exactly what happened on Thursday, August 22nd, 2013. Caleb had been looking forward to spending that evening and night with Corinda. The two of them had planned to take Caleb's kids to the kids' baseball games, and then after watching the kids play, they would drop the children off with Melissa, and then Caleb and Corinda would spend the night together at Pitch Pine Crescent. So Caleb had been more than disappointed when Corinda had told him earlier that day that because of a school commitment, she would not be able to join him after all. And when Caleb called Corinda from his house at 11 p.m. that night, sounding drunk, the two of them had gotten into a fight. Upset, Caleb had ended the call and turned off the ringer on his phone, and then decided to go to bed and watch a movie until he fell asleep. The next morning, Friday, August 23rd, the Harrison family house cleaner pulled up in her car in front of 3635 Pitch Pine Crescent. Carrying her supplies, she let herself into the house with the key Caleb had given her and wasted no time getting to work. Caleb had a standing request to the house cleaner that she not enter or clean his own bedroom upstairs. But even so, 3635 was a big house, and the cleaner had just started on the other 5 bedrooms when she was interrupted around noon by a sudden loud knock on the front door. It was one of Caleb's colleagues from CMC Electronics, and as he explained to the housekeeper, he was there to check on Caleb, who had not shown up for work that morning. A few minutes later, the housekeeper and Caleb's coworker had opened the door of the master bedroom where Caleb slept. Looking into the room, they both let out a sigh of relief. Caleb must have just overslept, that's why he had not gone to work, because there he was, lying in bed, the blanket pulled up to his chin, the edges tucked in around him. It wasn't until Caleb did not respond to being shaken awake that his coworker checked for a pulse and then realized that the 40-year-old father of 2 and the third member of the Harrison family was dead. Within minutes, Pitch Pine Crescent was once again awash in flashing lights and emergency vehicles, and it wasn't long before the same family members who had come to this house when Bill and Bridget died were once again ducking under a fluttering perimeter of crime scene tape to talk with law enforcement. And it wasn't just family that was experiencing a sense of déjà vu. Looking up at the high windows and sloped roof of 3635 Pitch Pine Crescent, the first paramedic on the scene turned to his partner. What he said would be repeated by other responding officials. You know what? I've been here before. Only this time, there was one huge difference, because this time, the Peel Regional Police Force knew right away that there was nothing accidental or natural about Caleb's death. Looking down at Caleb's body, the injuries were obvious, swollen knuckles like he fought hard to defend himself, along with deep scratches on his chest. And the bruising and abrasions on his neck would later provide evidence of the actual cause of death, strangulation. And suddenly, 4 years after the fact, a new team of investigators would begin to see the deaths of Caleb's parents, Bill and Bridget Harrison, 5 years ago, in a whole new light. Going back to the earlier reports on those deaths, the parallels to Caleb's death were startling and obvious. In 2005, the medical examiner had reported finding faint abrasions around Bill's neck too, along with a broken sternum, the long flat bone that protects the heart and forms the center of the chest. Police at the time had concluded that the neck abrasions were caused by a necklace that might have been tightened around Bill's neck when he collapsed in the bathroom. They also concluded that the broken sternum could have been caused by the same fall, triggering the heart arrhythmia that the doctor had listed as Bill's cause of death. Now, it looked like a blow to the chest, and manual strangulation could have caused those injuries. Likewise, the examination of Bridget's body 1 year later in 2006 had also revealed neck abrasions and evidence of neck compressions that could be consistent with strangulation, and the other injuries to her body could have been caused not by a fall down the stairs, but by a brutal fight with an attacker. It didn't take long for Harrison family relatives, along with the Canadian press, to draw their own conclusions. This was no coincidence. The Peel Regional Police Force had failed to do a thorough job investigating those earlier deaths, and now an entire family had just been wiped out. This time, the investigation into Caleb's death was handled not by local police, but by the Peel Regional Homicide Bureau. Since police had never ordered an autopsy on Bill's body, which was cremated 2 days after his death, and because the investigation into Bridget's death was now seen as very superficial, the new team of investigators basically had to start all over again from scratch. Only now they believed they were looking not at a single murder, but at a double or even triple homicide. By the afternoon of August 23rd, detectives were combing the Harrisons' neighborhood, going door to door to interview neighbors, searching for potential witnesses and video footage that might provide any clue to the murderer's identity. By that evening, they were interviewing Caleb's girlfriends, his ex-wife, his friends, co-workers, and family members. And once investigators took a giant step back and reviewed and then pieced together all the information and records and witness statements related to the Harrison family deaths, going all the way back to Bill's sudden supposed collapse 5 years earlier, a very new and shocking theory about what happened to the residents at 3635 Pitch Pine Crescent began to emerge. And this time, homicide detectives had a critical piece of physical evidence that might help them prove their suspicions. During the autopsy on Caleb's body, the medical examiner had found human tissue under Caleb's fingernails that investigators believed must belong to Caleb's murderer. And by the end of August, just over a week after Caleb's death, investigators had found the DNA match they were looking for. It would take investigators another 5 months to put together their case. Based on all the evidence they collected through interviews, search warrants, secretly recorded conversations, and wiretaps, here is a reconstruction of what police believe really happened to Bill, Bridget, and Caleb Harrison. Ever since July 1st, 2005, when Caleb had climbed behind the wheel of his mother's fancy Mercedes-Benz car and decided to drive home from a party even though he knew he was intoxicated, Caleb's killer had decided that Caleb was just another dangerous and drunken rich kid who should be locked up in jail for a long, long time. The killer had even done their best to make that happen by circulating a petition on Facebook calling for Caleb to get the maximum possible sentence for the drunk driving accident that had killed one person and badly injured 2 others. Instead, Caleb was out of prison after only 3 months and back to living his life of privilege in his family's great big house on Pitch Pine Crescent. As far as the killer was concerned, no matter how big a mess Caleb made of other people's lives, all he had to do was run to mom and dad, and they would make sure that Caleb got what Caleb wanted. It had been incredibly easy to kill Caleb's mother, Bridget. All the killer had had to do was wait until she was alone, walk right up to the front door, ring the bell, and then when Bridget answered, her purse in hand, the killer offered her a package, supposedly for her grandchildren. As Bridget reached out to take it, the killer had stepped inside, closing the door behind them and forcing Bridget backwards into the short hallway towards the bottom of the staircase. Bridget had barely had time to react before the first blows landed on her face, head, and chest. Then the killer wrapped their hands around Bridget's throat and squeezed harder and harder, fracturing the cartilage around her voice box and breaking her neck in several places. Within minutes, Bridget had stopped breathing, her lifeless body draped over the last 2 bottom steps of the stairway. Moments later, the killer had slipped back outside, and after walking casually to where they had parked some distance from the Harrisons' house, the killer had hopped behind the wheel of their car and driven slowly out of the quiet and sheltered neighborhood. But now, it was 4 years later, and the killer was back. It wasn't enough that both Bill and Bridget Harrison were now dead. The real problem all along had been Caleb. As the clock ticked over from Thursday night of August 22nd into the early morning hours of Friday, August 23rd, the killer arrived at Pitch Pine Crescent. Dressed in new sneakers and latex gloves and carrying a baseball bat, the killer quietly stepped to the front entryway just off the driveway. Unlocking the door, the killer slipped inside. Careful not to make any noise, the killer passed by the small bathroom on the right where Bill had died just over 4 years ago. Then, walking over the exact spot where the killer had beaten and strangled Bridget 3 years earlier, the killer climbed the steps to the second floor. Turning left at the top of the stairs, the killer followed the low hum of the bedroom fan to the end of the hallway, right to the door of the master bedroom. Soundlessly, the killer opened that door and stepped inside. Taking a deep breath, the killer allowed their eyes to adjust to the darkness before moving over to the bed where Caleb lay asleep, his eyes covered by a sleep mask. The killer noticed with distaste the layer of dust and dog hair that covered the bedroom floor carpet. And then, raising the baseball bat high over his head, the killer delivered a crushing blow to Caleb's chest. But instead of killing or immobilizing their victim, the sudden attack caused Caleb to literally spring up from the bed, ripping the face mask from his eyes and confronting his murderer. The struggle that followed did not last long. Caleb's attacker was huge, standing 6 foot 4 inches tall and weighing nearly 400 pounds. The killer literally threw Caleb into the shelving unit next to Caleb's bed. Then, ignoring Caleb's pleas for mercy and Caleb's offer of money, the killer stepped into the narrow space between the wall and the bed where Caleb sat in a crouch. Still not saying a word, Caleb's murderer wrapped his giant hands around Caleb's neck and strangled him to death. Then, Christopher Fattori, Melissa's new husband and the stepfather of Caleb and Melissa's 2 children, picked up Caleb's dead body and arranged it on top of Caleb's bed, pulling the blanket up to Caleb's chin and tucking the edges of the blanket around the side of Caleb's body. Retracing his steps, Chris made his way back downstairs to the front door. Before letting himself out, he patted his pants pocket to make sure he still had the key to 3635 Pitch Pine Crescent that he had stolen from Caleb's 12-year-old son, Mason. With Melissa's ex-husband dead, Melissa would no longer have to beg and fight for custody of their 2 children. And Chris would no longer have to worry about Caleb endangering the lives of the stepchildren that he, Chris, was also helping to raise. What Chris didn't know was that during Caleb's doomed attempt to defend himself against Chris, Caleb had managed to scratch Chris deeply enough that the medical examiner would later scrape Chris's DNA from under Caleb's fingernails. And when police went back through the files in the earlier investigation into Bridget's death 3 years ago, they found critical holes and inconsistencies in the alibis that Melissa and Chris had provided police. Meanwhile, information police had discovered from the day of Caleb's murder also left Melissa and Chris without solid alibis for Caleb's murder. Those discoveries immediately pushed Chris and Melissa to the top of the suspect list. But what detectives needed now were DNA samples they could compare to the tissues found under Caleb's fingernails. So, starting in late August, police began a surveillance operation so they could collect additional evidence. Within a week of Caleb's death, detectives hit pay dirt. They were able to get a sample of Chris's DNA from a cup he had drunk from and then thrown away in a public trash bin. The DNA from the saliva sample on the cup matched the tissue samples from under Caleb's fingernails. Police posing as garbage collectors were also able to find the shoes and gloves that Chris had worn the night of the murder. The dog hair and dirt on the bottom of those shoes matched the hair and dirt on the carpet in Caleb's bedroom, and the gloves contained DNA from both Chris and Caleb. It would turn out that each of the 3 Harrison family murders coincided with some critical turning point in Melissa and Caleb's bitter and long-running custody battle over their 2 kids. Police believe that Bill Harrison may have been alerted back on April 16, 2005, by a neighbor that Melissa and Chris were packing up their house, and it looked like maybe they planned to take the kids and leave town for good. Investigators speculated that Bill must have confronted Chris and Melissa and made it clear that he would call the police if they fled. And then Chris had followed Bill back to his home at Pitch Pine Crescent, and before Bill could take any action to stop the abduction of his grandchildren, Chris had strangled him, breaking Bill's sternum in the process. On the same day that Bridget discovered Bill's body, Chris and Melissa had taken the children off to Nova Scotia, where they would successfully hide for the next 7 months. Bridget Harrison had been killed a year later, one day before she was scheduled to testify at Melissa's parental abduction trial. Caleb Harrison had been murdered 3 years later, just before the custody arrangement he had with Melissa was about to change from Melissa getting unsupervised access to the kids back to Melissa getting only supervised visitation. Melissa Merritt and Christopher Fattori were both arrested on January 28, 2014, in a small community in Nova Scotia named Italy Cross. 2 weeks after Caleb's murder, as soon as Melissa was granted sole custody of Mason and Michaela, Melissa and Chris had packed up a few possessions and all 6 of their kids, and once again left Mississauga to head back to Canada's easternmost province. While they were in Nova Scotia, police found additional evidence on the laptop that the couple had left behind in Mississauga and on wiretapped conversations between Chris and Melissa to implicate Chris in the possible murder of Bill Harrison and to charge Melissa as a co-conspirator in the deaths of Bridget and Caleb Harrison. After their arrest, Chris confessed to the murders of Bridget and Caleb, insisting that he had done it for the sake of Melissa and the kids, and that Melissa had no knowledge or involvement. On January 13, 2018, 8 years after Caleb's death, Chris and Melissa were both found guilty of Caleb's murder. Chris alone was found guilty of Bridget's murder and not guilty in the death of Bill Harrison due to lack of evidence, like an actual body or autopsy report. Chris and Melissa were both sentenced to life in prison with a chance of parole after 25 years. The Harrison children were sent to live with Melissa's family. Later, in 2018, Melissa married a fellow prison inmate named Sheena McIntosh. In 2020, Chris Fattori started an online dating profile in which he described himself as very fit, fun, caring, easygoing, generous, and down-to-earth. Also in 2020, the Peel Regional Police Force was the subject of an internal review that found serious errors in how they handled and investigated the deaths of Bill and Bridget Harrison. On January 5, 2023, Melissa's murder conviction was overturned after the Ontario Court of Appeals ruled that there had been 2 serious errors in the instruction given to the jury regarding key evidence. Melissa remains in prison while awaiting her new trial.
Quiet sparks drift through the midnight air, lanterns woven out of soot and prayer. They glow like truths too soft to share, guiding footsteps where my heart lays bare. Every shimmer bends the dark, leaving trails that leave a mark. I follow every floating spark, a map of firelight star. I held on too long, too afraid to leave, chasing shadows of what I couldn't believe. Every word you said cut sharper than glass, but I stayed in the storm, letting moments pass. I lost my smile, I lost my nights, wrapped up in your wrongs, ignoring my rights. But now I see I can breathe again. No more echoes of your lies, no more pain, I'm not broken. I just found the strength to open door after door I left locked inside. I'm stepping out, leaving the chains off my heart. I'm free at last, the weight of.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, 1 hour before the Amazon Music follow button is set to fly to Tokyo, secretly sand off all of the magnetic strips on their credit cards.